It's good to be here. Thank you. Chicago is my first city in so many ways, and my family's here. My husband's from this town, and so I've got family in the room, and I've got my two best friends in the world here today. And if you hear nothing else I say today, let it be that disability is a profound rebuke to the myth of autonomy that we live hermetically sealed little bodies in the world, when the truth is that interdependence is who we are. We co-create each other, and those people have made me, so I'm glad to be here to share with you. So before I get to graphic and to design and engineering, I'm an artist, and I use the language of design in an engineering school, and I'll tell you about that. But I want to just start this talk summoning to the room all the collective stakes that are shared here today in disability. So all the disability, temporary or long-term conditions that we might be seeking cures for, and things that actually just make us who we are, and things that are put us at odds with kind of the standard way of being in the world. So if you're here today, try to bring everything to mind, if you could, that might be included in this. So I'm talking about your aging parents. Maybe some of you are thinking about them right now, and what's going on for them, their fears and some of the changes in their bodies around aging. I'm talking about your own aging, a subject we don't often talk about together. So maybe someone is gently suggesting to you these days that it might be time for hearing aids or a very elegant cane. I personally have brought my reading glasses, which are my favorite thing in the world right now. I may be sternly looking at you over the tops of these. I've been practicing my whole life, that reproachful, stern look, you know what I mean. So let those things be here. Let also chronic illness and pain that people live with, people you love might be living with. And of course, I mean the pain, too, of interior worlds that many of us and people that we love are working on right now. Anxiety and depression and so on. And call to mind, if you will, the children in your lives that you love who may be getting a new diagnosis or may be confused about how they're navigating the world. I say this to say, let self and the people that you love, let that be text. Let this be, yes, a forum of ideas, but also let body and affect be in the room, if we can. So, graphic is the theme of this conference, and it's a really interesting one for me. Let me get to where... it's a really interesting one for me. So I'm an artist and a design researcher. I work at Olin College, which is an engineering school, and I'll show you some projects that are much more about engineering. But I'll start with this project, which is about the International Symbol of Access. But hold in your mind, while you're looking at this, the images in this project, the question of actually when is design. So lots of times people think of design as, okay, is it graphics, is it products, is it architecture? I'm interested in the temporal aspect, so let me just show you what I mean by that. About a dozen years ago, I started looking closely at this symbol that's familiar to you, the International Symbol of Access, and all of the profound historic work that it does in the built environment, the way it protects parking spaces and doors and so on. But I started noticing something interesting, which is that while you'll see that image that's above in this picture that I'm showing you, most often you'll see variations on it occasionally, like the one below it, just a tiny percentage I was noticing at that time. But look at the difference between those two images. What they're called isotypes. So the one on the top has this rather mechanical and kind of rectilinear look about it. And I thought, isn't it interesting that I was at MoMA in New York and a couple of stores around Boston where I am, and I started noticing the difference between those two. Where is the body? Where are the organic shapes that are the body? Where are the mechanics? And where is the technology? So I was running a blog at this time, and I sort of noted this really in a kind of casual way. And I then started to look in the built environment at this symbol, at the International Symbol of Access, and all the variations I could find on it. So here it is at Marshall's. Here's this figure now in motion. And I thought, my goodness, what a difference for such a profound kind of graphic doing work in the built environment. So then I started looking at the way isotypes are working in the environment in general, and that's what these are, these 2D images that are usually 2 colors only. So if you go to a national park or to a sort of local recreation facility, you'll see all the stuff that you can do there. So you can fish and you can ski, and you don't need any language for this. You know immediately what it is you can do and what you can't do. And I love the elegance of this. And I started actually to tunnel deep into the realm of isotypes that I recommend to you. If you're bored on a Sunday afternoon, you should look up Stick Figures in Peril. Just thousands of ways that you can get into trouble. My goodness. What would you do in this situation? Yeah. So here was this operatic drama playing out, right, of bodies and the built environment. And I thought, my goodness, well, what about this? What about this? Which is so recent, but has gone to sleep in our politics. That is, how is it that you make provisions for wheelchair use in the built environment and all that comes with it, curb cuts and so on. So at the time, I was working with a philosopher/graffiti artist, which is not something you find in just every day. But we started collaborating on a kind of, what would this look like to intervene in the built environment and to think about this symbol and to wake it from those slumbering politics. And after a bunch of iteration, we ended up with this version, which is a clear-backed sticker that shows a new image that is a person driving this wheelchair, not associated with athleticness or speed or anything, but just foregrounding a person using a chair, no more, no less. And my graffiti artist collaborator was saying, well, why don't we just put a new symbol altogether on these and be done with it? But I understood, as someone who has done public art, that it matters that if you're going to make a change, that you hold a question in public, that you make an alteration, and that you draw a big circle around it and point to it and say, what about this? What about this? That is the language of kind of critical or interrogative design we can talk about. So long story short, we were approached by a lot of people, self-advocates with disabilities, who said to us, that's fine that you did a street art project, that's lovely, but we'd actually like a real symbol that is ours, that is appropriatable by us. And so we worked with a graphic designer to make this new symbol that you're seeing here on the right. And it's in the public domain. It's free for use. I like to think of it as what Ivan Illich called a convivial tool. So open, coercive, flexible, appropriatable. We're a footnote in the use of this image. But if you want to have a conversation about the graphic qualities of it, we can do that, about the ways that the body, again, is rounded, about the forward motion that's indicated here. Here it is on, just how it meets the very strict and important standards of kind of typical isotypes. But this project, this graphic, actually comes alive when stuff happens around it. And that's when the project really took off. So this is an image of self-advocates with disabilities using that image to repaint the stencils of a parking lot at a nonprofit in Malden, Massachusetts. So this was a kind of exchange day, a volunteer day, where lawyers came from kind of big fancy firms in Boston, came to do a day of volunteerism as like an off-site team building process. And normally they would do things like paint the basement or do some kind of service project. And the leader of this organization said, no, we should repaint these together. And then we should have a conversation about how we're alike, about how we're different, what is disability in public, and so on. So here's Brendan Hildreth, who is one of the students at this day center, was at this time, painting this image and having this conversation. And Brendan, who moved since to North Carolina, has used this image not to promote graphic design, of course not, but to actually ask the world what it is that he wants. He uses text-to-speech technology, doesn't use a chair, but uses all kinds of adaptive gear to make his wishes known. And what are those wishes? As simple and profound as education, transportation, employment, and the rest. So this project took on a life that my collaborator and I could not have predicted, and we started to hear stories from, like this one, from a doctor in Delhi, India, who said, I know exactly what you're doing. I used your symbol on the front of my rehab hospital. I'm advocating in my province for disability rights. And high five over the internet. You know, it was just kind of like, I see you, and the node of the graphic was actually a way for us to find each other and not to make our situations the same and not to have a tidy consensus about our politics, but instead to say, oh, here was a little flag, and that's how we connected. So now, again, this project has far outpaced our authorship, which is a sign of success, I would say. You can find it in very official places and in places that I have no context for whatsoever. You can find it building a kind of coalition politics that I wish I could take credit for, but I can't. Happy to see that. Informal and formal, casual, and so on. Nobody was more surprised than we are that it's now in the permanent collection at MoMA and the Cooper Hewitt. But so here was its life, a kind of what-if question, a graphic as a what-if question, and to live as a question in public. I hope that is the lifeblood of that work. Here's just the kind of scraping the Facebook data from images that people have sent to us where this has appeared in the world. And then when images like this came through my Instagram, I thought, my goodness, you know, again, free, non-coercive, open, appropriatable, I hope, in the convivial tool sense. Here's the Women's March in Oakland, California. So, when is design? When is it? When would we say it is? And who are the designers? I think Ezio Manzini talks about the need for expert design, but also diffusive design, that each of us is doing what? We are taking the conditions, the inherited conditions of the world, and we are making new ones. We are unmaking what's there. We are remaking in turn, that we are doing design work when we are intervening in the conditions of the built world with new conditions in its place to prototype together an alternative. So, is it the graphic? Yes and no. But I think more it's what Maxine Greene called social imagination that's happening in design when design goes out with people. Greene says that social imagination is when people come together, a little bit like this, but when you gather around an artifact, a performance, music, something together, and you talk about that thing. What happens in that encounter is that you are, what she said, you are thinking as if things could be otherwise. Which sounds obvious, I suppose, and yet how do we cease not just diagnosing the ills of our time and of our situation and our culture, but how do we prototype the possibility, the imaginary of the future, a what-if question? So that is what I hope the Icon Project did. So I usually don't start talks with that project, but it's so well suited to this theme. I'll now walk you out a little bit further to other scales of design. Again, I'm an artist in my training. I use the language of design. I use that in a house of engineering. So it's what I do, languages that I speak, and then the context in which that comes alive. And I'm showing you the screenshot from my lab at Olin College, which is an all-engineering college outside of Boston. 350 students total. We're a tiny little place, no departments, 50-50 men and women by policy. Really interesting place to work. So I teach adaptive and assistive technologies for students. They think it's going to be about prosthetics and about technology, and my invitation to them is actually to think about disability differently. So I'll just give you an example of some of the work that we do. So I'm showing you an image of a woman named Amanda Kasha. Amanda is a professor and an art historian and a curator, and she's also a little person, so she has a form of dwarfism, stands under 4 feet tall. And Amanda, I'm showing you here what it looks like when Amanda is standing at a podium or a lectern like this one that I'm standing at here, what she would call a leggy podium, so scaled for a standardized body like mine. But you can imagine that Amanda's body is quite out of sync, actually, with a standard podium, and so she has had to stand on steps or some other kind of support. So she commissioned and had built this wooden podium that you see here, which was scaled for her height. But she travels and she's speaking all over the place, so she can't carry around a wooden podium. So she said to me, could you design a lectern for my scale, but that would be portable, so I could take it with me on an airplane? But it would be sturdy enough to hold on my things, and what would that material look like, and how would it go? And this was an irresistible challenge to a designer, as you might imagine, and not exactly what my engineering students were expecting when they think of prosthetics. They're expecting, what, replacement parts. They're expecting cyborg-style limbs. What happens when somebody comes to us and says, I'm actually not looking for a fix of the kind that you have on hand. I'm looking for a tool to meet the world and make the world come to me a little bit. So here are students, I'm just showing you some of the process of thinking about how that object would fold flat. How many moves could we do it in, and what would be the elegant way to make it unfold and assemble and to disassemble? They ended up using this material, which is carbon fiber. Carbon fiber is typically used in automotive and aerospace applications. It's a super high performance material. We didn't have to use it, but it is suited to this kind of sturdy but also lightweight constraint that we had. And I also just love that it registers with such how powerful kinds of tools. So here are those engineers curing that carbon fiber, and here's the podium, how it looks, 1, 2, 3, the unfolded kind of steps that takes. Okay, but here's where the magic happens, and that's when Amanda walks out and gets introduced in a place like this, like where I would be. And Amanda often performs in real time the unfolding and the setting up of that lectern. So imagine that the room contracts to her scale momentarily, and then she finishes, and the room breathes back out to its ordinary standards. I'll just show you the kind of afterlife of this, is that we had an industrial designer who volunteered to help us do a 2.0 version. So here it is in high-performance plastic with weight taken out of it, those holes, so beautiful. And here's Amanda in the classroom using that podium. Now, anyone who's interested a little bit in engineering will say, that widget doesn't scale, like that's not a thing you're gonna make at 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. So what is this work of the design for one human being? How do you justify it? What is this role in design? That's what I mean about critical and interrogative design, is a what-if question, social imagination, what if things could be otherwise? And the role of that object is a cultural role, finally. It matters that it works. And it was absolutely manufactured in an engineering school with engineering specs around it. But its work is to ask and to suspend questions that get under your skin a little bit. Who is the world designed for? What's the role of standardization? It's an era of digital fabrication. What if Amanda could carry her specs around with her and plug into existing manufacturing streams? So there's, I think, quite a lot there that's both, we think of engineering as solving problems and artists as asking questions. And my work has been a kind of insistence that we make room for both, and that sometimes the same skills can be housed in the direction of solutions and also in the direction of questions. That you get a world that you want, you get an otherwise, not only by tidy fixes, and certainly not only by technology, but by better, sharper questions. Who do we mean? Who's asking? What are they asking for? What's the world? How could the world bend and not just the body adapt? Okay, so I'll tell you another story about another project that's quite different. This is a story about a woman named Cindy, who's now about 65. Cindy had a heart attack and an extended coma as a result of that heart attack. That meant when she woke up from that coma, she had lost nearly all of the digits on both hands, and then both of her lower leg limbs. And this is quite a different body to wake up in at age 60. So what she qualified for is, of course, what my students want to see, and that is this $80,000 best you can buy engineered replacement arm and hand. And these are astonishing feats of engineering, and no one celebrates them more than I do. But the reason why I started talking to Cindy is because she went through an elaborate insurance process to qualify for this kind of tool, trained to use it, and so on. And it is literally collecting dust in a closet at her house right now. Because the kinds of things that she needed to build for herself, it turns out, were these unbelievably clever dozens of tiny tools, tiny low-cost hacks that are actually making her work, her body work. So with an anthropologist colleague, I created a project which is not my design. It's just my collection and design attention to something that's already going on called Engineering at Home. And it's an archive of things that never count as technologies, but are technologies nonetheless, the stuff that makes Cindy's life work. So rubber tubing for her eyeliner, zip ties, that beautiful ratchet technology. Is anybody in here like in love with the elegance of the, thank you, my people. Right, the zip ties are making Cindy, I mean, she just keeps them in dozens, in drawers, in her car, right? Because zippers, what is happening with a zipper there? It's difficult for anybody with a tiny bit of fine motor kind of compromise. Or this object, which is my favorite by far. So Cindy said to her prosthetist after she'd been working with him for a while, you know, couldn't you make something to help me write again? I write thank you notes. It's a thing that I do, and I've lost that capacity. And this is a really interesting moment, right? Because in 2018, does Cindy need to actually write anything? She doesn't. Speech to text is great on the smartphone, but she wanted to. So she said to her prosthetist, can't we do something? And for pennies, scraps of silicone, here's a cap that goes over her wrist with a pen lodged just so, and it's Cindy's recognizable handwriting that resulted. Imagine. So thinking as if things could be otherwise is in part a kind of quality of agency and an awakeness to the idea that you could ask for an alternative, and that the thing that has been designed for you to rescue you from your condition may not be the thing that you're actually really wanting. And there may be, you know, nobody looks at Cindy and says, oh, there's a Brooklyn makerspace hacker hipster, you know? Like, oh, you know, prototyping in the, no. But here she is nonetheless, with that agency, with that diffusive design, with the impulse to do it. So they went on to make fork, knife, and I'm just also showing you some of the other clever patch jobs that also count as engineering. So Engineering at Home is this archive, and then it's a kind of manifesto that my colleague and I wrote together saying, this counts too. It counts as technology, it counts as engineering, it counts as the otherwise of the world that we're trying to ask for. It's not a rejection of the Darth Vader arm, that's what she calls it. It's not a rejection of this. You all can hold these complicated notions in your head. This is transformative technology for people, sometimes. I'm all about it. And also, I want a really wide canopy for which tools are people using and when and why. When is the design happening? It's coming from Cindy, an unlikely kind of subject that you don't expect, right? And it's coming perhaps in a low technology that doesn't cost a lot of money, and it actually didn't depend on novel materials or anything, but technology nonetheless. So solving problems, asking questions. That project actually just closed at an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum called The Future Starts Here. And literally, it's like geoengineering and like Facebook drone, and then like Cindy's fork holder. Really. And I never could have imagined that would go there, but I love that they understood, the curators there understood, oh, what is the future being prototyped? Sometimes it's drones, sometimes it's big tech, sometimes it's software, and sometimes it's silicone, you know, like, will we have all our wits about us? When is design? Okay. The last story I'll tell you is about an obsession with the inclined plane. Any Ratchet fans, also Simple Machine fans, so this is a kind of a project that's organized and obsessed around the simple machine, that is the inclined plane, or ramp. So it's doing machinic work, even though it doesn't appear to be moving. It's altering force just by the shape of the surface, like a lever, a pulley, screw, these classical alphabet of machines. So this project started 5 years ago now, a little family of ramps that are about 3 foot square and are on casters, so they're portable, got a big piano hinge in the front, they stack, they nest, they've got leveling feet. And they are designed to do something in public that you don't often see, which is to have the same tool used by 2 different kinds of city users that never appear in the same story: skateboarders and wheelchair users, both using wheeled mobile gear, both marginalized for different reasons, and both using the magic of the inclined plane, those political physics, to get their work done. So you can see on the left that a skateboarder is always repurposing and purposefully reappropriating the structures of the built environment for play. But you're also seeing this ramp being used at a single-step entrance, which is an architectural typology you'll find all over the place in cities like mine and Boston. So here's the prevalence in Cambridge, on Cambridge Street in Cambridge, where I live, of that typology alone, all over New York, Toronto, Seoul. So this project is a way to make a kind of weird Venn diagram between those kinds of city users and to ask a question in public. To do a solution work, those are over-engineered to take a full body in a motorized chair, absolutely. But it's also a way to defamiliarize and estrange the expectations for what that thing does. So here again, just like in the Icon project, the material created conditions that were actually where the project really came alive. So this is in Toronto, where I ran a workshop with skateboarder community organizers and wheelchair users to look at the built environment, take stock of what's happening there, inclined planes and more, and we remapped that part of Toronto and tried to say, what does the future of the built environment look like? And I also assembled a panel of a wheelchair activist on the far right. That's Luke Anderson of the Stopgap Project, which I also recommend to you. Skateboarder, a person from Parks and Recreation in Toronto, the person who has the capacity to say what the future of the built environment might look like. So that was one kind of event. And then this project kind of like blew off the doors off my notion of what ramps could do when I got a call from this woman, Alice Shepard, who's a wheelchair dancer. And she said, I heard you're a ramps person. I'm looking for a ramp, but not for access to a building. I'm looking for a ramp for stage to make beautiful dance with, to use those physics, acceleration, resistance. So she came to campus, and we got a provisional dance studio going for Alice. And we took the measure of our own built environment. She went to the motion capture lab, and students built, you can see my little ramps there in the front, and students built these ramps to sort of go, okay, well, how high does she want to go to stay safe when she descends, and what's the drama of the move that she wants to make? So here, students ended up building this truly unbelievable ramped landscape that goes on 24-foot square, basically. Here are these 18 and 19-year-old first-year students who decided, no, we're going to prototype the actual thing in a very buttoned-up administration building, I might add. We got in a little trouble for that. So here it is being built for Alice. And she came back to campus and with a collaborator named Laurel Lawson, and here was this beautiful thing, right? And the encounters that we had then among these students who were in a mechanics class, after all, asking themselves, what are these physics? What are they for? And who am I as engineer in this exchange? And what do I do with the dissonance in my head about what a wheelchair user does and does not do? All that productive uncertainty. So here's a little clip of Alice. So in the course of doing that work with Alice, I was invited by the Seoul Museum of Art to propose something for a biennial there about ramps. And I thought, my goodness, this is just so engaging and compelling to have Alice be partnering on this. And so we had done the big ramped landscape, and that really is so much my students. But I said, well, isn't it interesting how we've sort of also created this secondary situation, which is like what I've been calling a platform kit. So it's little ramps, reconfigurable with dance tiles to make a landscape for play. So we took this project to Seoul, and Alice came along and performed on a Sunday afternoon in August. We also had special invitations to local wheelchair users there, had a bunch of meetings with disability advocates, folks using wheelchairs, folks working on other kinds of cognitive disability stuff. We ran a workshop to map access in a local neighborhood and had all kinds of, again, the design was the launching pad for a series of exchanges. Here was a convivial tool, we hoped, by which we could meet each other and say, our contexts are different. What is it that we're united by? Here's the youngest mobile wheeled gear users in Seoul. We had lots of these after-hour shots of bikes playing on these landscapes too. And at the end, then, those little ramps that started so long ago were donated to local nonprofits where they've got that kind of single-step condition. Do temporary ramps exist? Of course they do, right? But you see what's happening here to bring design attention and to draw a circle around a change and to point at it and to say, what is it? Who gets access? And where is the technology? And can we make this not a complaint-driven and compliance conversation, but one of profound creativity? How it is that we move through public space, who's included, how do we get where we're trying to go? So that's Slope Intercept is the name of that project, which is the only math joke I ever intend to achieve. So when is design? When is it? When indeed? Surely some of you all have people in your lives who you recognize also as asking questions. Can I be in this world, right? Can the world actually shapeshift and move and make accommodations for me, or must I always come to it? I'm interested in design and in technology, 2D, 3D, wherever it may take place, where those questions are answerable by the world, not merely the responsibility of individuals, but a collective reimagining, making, unmaking, remaking. That social imagination, that thinking as if things could be otherwise, it calls for expertise, of course, but mostly it calls for design at the most diffuse and networked levels that we look together. At what scale, right? Is it graphics? Is it tools? Is it software? And how would we know? And can we talk to one another better through the things that we make? I'll just end with a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, actually, who's Maxine Greene was also obsessed with, that I think about a lot. He said that it's on the day we can conceive of a different state of affairs that a new light falls on our troubles, and we decide that these are unbearable. That, to me, is what social design is about, being the day on which we can conceive a new state of affairs, that the prototype in engineering, that the performance, that the new story in the arts, that is the day we can conceive of a different state of affairs. We have to see it. It has to be externalized. It's social in nature. That's where design gets its liftoff. The day we can conceive of a new state of affairs, then now, suddenly, these things are unacceptable to us. So that's all I'll tell you about my own work. I am writing a book right now, which is not about my work, but about lots of other places where ideas are being prototyped, sometimes by designers and sometimes by other folks. So I'm looking at architecture for dementia and residences for ALS and cardboard furniture being made by and for young people with disabilities. So whatever it is that's on your minds, let's talk about that stuff now. But thank you for this attention.
We have 2 mics circulating for questions.
Are the 3 designs that you showed basically a form of E.F. Schumacher's appropriate technology idea?
Yes, so the question is about appropriate technology, which is a movement in the late 60s, early 70s to think about all kinds of technology, that is, including cardboard and paper as also technology, and you're absolutely right, it's in the legacy of appropriate tech, for sure. My understanding is that appropriate tech has kind of come under fire for different kinds of scholarly reasons that I'm not really privy to. So people, whenever I say, isn't this all appropriate technology? They say, well, it's sort of different because of who the actors were and so on. I think it is absolutely in that legacy. I mean, there are a number of legacies in which this exists, like the kind of revival of craft in the late 19th century. I mean, Gandhi was also very active in thinking about tradition and craft and low technology as a kind of affront to relentless industrialization, modernization. So like we can point to a lot of historical lineages, I think, but the interesting thing to me is that we still live in 2018 under a tidal wave of excitement about software as being kind of the great hope of the future. So my work is just to reiterate, also, this counts too. Yeah, or who's running the mics?
We have a question house, right?
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, sorry. It seems that you've, using the language of design, taught the engineering students that sometimes it is very easy to have the solution overtake the problem it's trying to solve. And it's very valuable for them to learn that. What have they taught you as engineers that you use in your art?
Where to begin? Oh, my. I mean, it really was, once I started to look at technology, where my training is in humanities, once I started to look at technology, that's what gave me, for instance, the love of physics, of simple machines. Like just absorbing the language of material science, the very ordinary properties of mechanics, you know, I'm asking my colleagues all the time, what is momentum again? In other words, just being an interlocutor in an engineering school has given me like a do-over. Because I was raised as a person to think, if you're good at the arts and the expressive forms, then you're probably not good at math and science. And now I'm getting like this whole rehearsal where I get to kind of have a do-over in my disposition. So I'm just interested now in mathematics and in physics in a way that I wasn't able to. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah. Applications and stuff, but yeah, like now it opens up a whole other realm of how you can produce art. It seems that you're saying is, sorry.
It opens up a whole realm of art that is actually absolutely true. I mean, I think my work lives in a legacy of like what's called social practice in art, right? Which is events, durational kinds of projects, that some of which have artifacts, some of which have encounters, and so I think it lives there where lots of other artists also have trafficked in and out of mathematics and science and so on. I do think one of the questions that sort of starts to haunt my work is, well, when are you going to roll out the ramps? Like those ramps would scale. When are you going to roll out the ramps as a kind of natural engineering product scale, you know, kind of logic for production, if that makes sense. And I'm always saying, actually, I think my role in my post is as culture maker. So I'm asking the what if question, and that's where I really thrive. And I think if I were to get derailed on a kind of production line, but I do create conditions whereby young engineers could take up things and have products sort of go out from that, because that's for them what feels like their post. I need to have solutions, I need them to scale, I need them, you follow?
Yeah, and what's important is you're sharing the designs and everything with the world. But what you're commented on about how kind of fundamentally at the beginning of art and science, they were one and the same, like with Da Vinci and and then now it kind of seems more of people are like you're either one or the other, which it really doesn't have to be that way, and you can create these incredible things and utilizing both.
That's right. I mean, but also the kind of erasing that two cultures thing of science versus art, that's also an old conversation, right? And lots of people will go like, we need interdisciplinary, blah, blah, blah. Like everybody's affirmative about like interdisciplinary connections. But what I find, I mean, I'm in an engineering school, right, where students have down-selected to math and science over their high school years, and they're betting on an ROI model of their education, right? And they're not wrong about that. They're getting out, they're getting like really well-paying and culturally rewarded software jobs. So my job there is not to go, let's be a well-rounded engineer. That's far too, for me, far too domesticated and safe, given the urgency of our politics now. No, what I'm saying is, It's possible, young person getting an engineering education, that you will have the tool that somebody is asking for a desirable future. It's also possible that you will not have that tool, either as a civic actor or as an employee one day. And what I want you to know right now is that you should call the artists some of the time, call the policy folks, right? It's just about modesty and humility, finally, that, you know, that keeps needing to be reiterated. So,
We have one over here.
I'd like to ask you about a more general question. Of course, all of us have some disabilities, and the one I'm running into is bad driving with aging. I had a friend that's disabled and is in a scooter, so originally I thought I'd ask you about that. But what I'd like to ask you about is your students that are interested in software, interested in getting good jobs as engineers, what are you doing to equip them to work with smart cars, self-driving cars, things like that, in your thinking, that's going to allow them to succeed where people like Ivan Illich, of course, their ideas are complete failures in practice?
well, okay, so there's a lot happening in that question. I don't equip students to think about the mechanic, the viability of self-driving cars, for sure. My role, again, as kind of culture, humanities trained person, is to say, what is your relationship to the questions right now, right? And if you walk out, young person, and you decide to be a cog in a larger kind of big effort, right, that self-driving cars is a kind of future that's kind of inevitable, right? And we've decided that this is going to happen, and we've decided it's a good thing, and like, we're going to maybe deal with the ethics over here. I'm trying to equip my students to say, what is this inevitability narrative that I'm entering into, and what is my role in it? Now, is that going to help them actually figure out the tiny nuances? It's not, right? For that, I need my colleagues. But I will say that I'm helping them ask deep why and should questions in a moment in history where we're looking to technology as a kind of panacea for all social ills. So I don't doubt that there's probably some good affordances of self-driving cars. I'm interested in people, the wisest possible people, the sharpest possible questions being in the room. So what else? Yeah.
I think we have one house right.
I'm just curious about your value system for universal solutions where one size fits everybody, and highly personalized, one size fits one, and if there's a value you place on one versus the other.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about that a lot. So this is about what's often called universal design. So if you have an OXO vegetable peeler in your house, anybody have those OXO peelers? Yeah. So that's a classic story in universal design where it was that rubber handle is sort of made to alleviate the condition of arthritis. And if you cut that carrot better, and then it turns out that that's a more ergonomic design for everyone. Curb cuts are, of course, the classic example of this. So the fact that you get a little slope at the end of at the corner of the sidewalk means you get strollers, and wheeled luggage actually comes to the market, like suspiciously right around the time that curb cuts roll out everywhere. It's really interesting. That's my pet theory. So right, the universal design effect, and usually this is the first place people go when I talk about my work. I think universal design is an aspiration in product design, absolutely, for things that will scale. My sense is that history shows that those examples are relatively few and far between if the logic of scalability is your metric for success. And I am interested in 2018, platforms for working that scale. So one of the things I didn't show you today in the Cindy kind of vein is the Adaptive Design Association in New York, which started at Perkins School for the Blind. And they make cardboard carpentry furniture, highly bespoke, completely custom, out of triple wall cardboard, which is super robust, and PVC pipe and things like this, for students who need things that they can't get on the market or they can't afford them. So 6 or 7 tools for a young kid who's 9, born without legs, their body's gonna change in a year and in a year again, right? Amazing, amazing stuff. And people go like, well, this is so nice, that like you're doing this design for one, but gosh, in the real world, it really wouldn't happen. And I think like, no, that's a networked platform for working. You scale up that networked platform. You decentralize, you have local kinds of question askers, local fabricators, and local needs met. I mean, this to me, so in other words, I am more interested in thinking in the far future about like just like poking on that logic of scale, the widget that scales. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that, again, I just can only say that my work is to, my students will say, this is all like a nice thought project, Sarah. This is a nice, but I need to know that my solutions go out, right? But I am 100% in defense of the work of culture and the what if question to keep motivating people and say, what are we really after? The restless questions that stay restless. Because sometimes I think the universal design thing is a beautiful, tidy story by which politics, transportation, education is not addressed. So, yeah, thank you for that.
We have a question in the center.
Hi, so I wonder, we talk about people with disabilities less and less like a block, but I think it's important to understand that beyond the fact that people have disabilities, they're women, they're people of color, they're poor, they're of a different religion and a different ethnic background. Mm-hmm. So you talk a lot about the social, you talk a lot about culture, but I wonder, in an institution like the one you're working in, what are some of the limitations for students to understand these differences? And what do you think, if you had the power to suggest other tools for these sorts of institutions, what would they be?
Precisely to get at the multiplicity of identity. That's what you mean, right? Yes, that is a really good question. And it's, let's see, a couple of things. One is that it has mattered to the disability rights community. I guess maybe it's important to say that I'm the mother of a child with Down syndrome and the sibling and aunt and more to a number of people on the autism spectrum and share my DNA with those people. So I'm very embedded in the very unglamorous politics all the time of disability rights. But I will say that, of course, it has been politically strategic to identify as a block, right? And that I think people still tend to differentiate, right, between folks who are thinking about mental illness and folks who are thinking about cognitive disability and folks who are thinking about aging. And people go like, oh, yeah, wait a minute, that's all one thing, and in terms of political rights and so on. But I will say that, what I'd say is that my class, which is called Investigating Normal, is like a friendly Trojan horse. So I go like, come for the cool cyborg stuff and stay for the critical theory. It's like, and that's where I get at like, oh, guess what? It's actually race and gender and stuff too. And so the media that we read and the stories that we take in, and of course that includes some heavy-duty dense scholarship. But when I have Alice in the room, who's a Black British immigrant to this country who uses a wheelchair, that's where project-based learning really gets its wings, right? Because she is speaking past all of their intellectual fear and their nervousness and their wondering if they're going to be offensive and all their misconceptions about what it is to use a wheelchair. So I just, like, Alice comes in the room and I think like, whew, we're going to read this stuff too. But that's where the content really happens. And this is what I mean about convivial tools is that we're making a ramp together, so we're not just having this very like careful logocentric exchange. We're like in there with the drills and the thing and like how are we going to make but what's happening is like between us, that's what's happening, right? Is that they are making sense. Oh, I didn't want to be surprised that a person with a wheelchair has a beautiful balletic experience of the built environment, but I am surprised. But Alice is going to forgive me for being surprised because we're going to make something. You know what I mean? It just does all that bundled work. It's so beautiful and takes forever.
We have another question at center.
So my question is related to design literacy. So I'm a trained economist. I got interested in health economics. My first job was in a medical school, so it was a shock to be, actually talking to future doctors. And I had the good fortune to have a friend who was interested in design. He's an EM doctor. And it was like a whole world open to me where I could communicate better, where I could think some of the questions that I was thinking about, where I became incredibly cautious about using the word incentives. Mm-hmm. And then I felt cheated. I have 2 masters and a PhD. And here I was, at a medical school in New York, teaching. I was right out of grad school. And I felt I had never been taught about design or thinking in terms of design or communicating across other disciplines in such a way like design. And then, right now I think I'm a big advocate, I'm like an amateur learner of the space, but I just think, gosh, like, you guys need to talk to like, you guys really need to. There has to be such thing as design literacy. Yeah. And so, just any thoughts you have about that?
Yeah, you know, a friend of mine in London was tapped to be on the, I want to say, the mayor's kind of design council, and he was gleeful because he said, we're actually not being asked to design anything. Like, and they weren't just thinking of the designers as, here's the folks who can kind of execute and build the building. It's like, no, he understood that what we think about is behavior, flows, relationships, right? And our relationship to questions, which is like, do you have the agility and the resilience to zoom way in on the details and then refract that question and go way up by 20,000 feet? That's what you're describing. The one thing that I would say that I'm noticing that I'm a little nervous about is the kind of design thinking rage in academia that stands to kind of erase the other humanities disciplines in which design has become literate, right? So ethnography and anthropology. And so I worry, I don't use the term design thinking just because I'm trying to resist a little bit some of that. It's a recapitulation of Silicon Valley logic of sort of like, I have a hammer, where are my nails? I will find them, you know, and the idea that you can take any question through a set of paces and a formula and then arrive at an answer. So I am for design literacy, but it's a multiplicitous affair. And I mean, I'm just for designers, people thinking in terms of design, people asking designers to weigh in, and also for designers to relinquish to be medium agnostic, I often say, right? So like, I'm a graphic designer, like, great. I'm an architect, great. But like, can you come to the table and just say, let's think about this in a relationship to questions, most of all. So thank you. Got questions over here.
We have one house right.
Hi, my name is Bree, and I'm really familiar with the Accessible Icon Project. I'm also kind of a colleague of Amanda's, so it's really nice to put a face to all the work you've done, so thank you.
Thank you.
I have lots of questions. I'll try to pick one to focus on. I'm recently kind of joining up with a team of disabled creatives that are forming this organization called the Disabled List. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, yes,
at all?
of course.
Okay,
Liz
okay.
Jackson.
Yes, I just met with her yesterday.
Yeah, nice.
So that seems to be an alternative route to this sort of like design thinking, and it's basically an organization of people with disabilities that are creatives that consult with larger design corporations to actually use a person with a disability experience instead of assuming what it would be like, and using this idea of empathy, which is kind of problematic.
Very.
Right? Yep. So how do you feel about a system like that, which seems to lead, it will lead to like larger production of like a mass product?
Yeah,
you know?
I'm a fan. I mean, especially because the key conjunction there is with, right? And I know Liz has really pressed on this, so we can talk about design for disability, and that has shaded too often over into like soft piano music swelling in the background, you know, like
right.
I'll never, like, if I had a dime for all the videos with the, you know, and where the protagonist is the technology, right? People mean well, people mean very well, but this idea still is that there is a suffering person, and thank goodness that technologists came along and saved them from their body, right? But the Disabled List, among other really good human-centered design, and this is a particularly good model, is placing, right, people with disabilities, or people who would call themselves disabled people. Do you use that term?
I do.
Yeah. I mean, so that we can talk about language if you want to, but where disabled people are partnered with in firms. And I think, to be honest, I think the biggest provision of this is that it gets people in firms comfortable talking to people who are unlike themselves. Mm-hmm. And I really believe, I'm kind of an assume no malice sort of person. Like, I really think that my students and their counterparts 10 years and beyond want to do this work, but they are terrified of offending people, and they don't know how to begin, and so they just stop because they think like it would be worse to do it wrong than to do nothing. And so this is a way of going like, look, we're going to broker a relationship here, you know, and we're going to let's just talk about the failure modes. I mean, when Amanda is in my classroom, I say to my students, are you wondering if you can say the word dwarfism? And they're like, yes, you know, and I'm saying, and we have talked about it beforehand, so I'm saying to Amanda, what is your position on language, and how do we even get around this stuff? And it's a relational model of working, which sounds so simple, but it's profound, right? So I think you're right, and this is another scalable model for working. Instead of a scalable widget, a scalable platform to connect, yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for just one more. I see one in the center. Thank you.
I've noticed that the symbol of accessibility, the new one, has been spreading quickly a lot in the last few years. I was wondering if you could explain, one, why that has been so successful and growing, and two, if you have met any resistance to this new symbol and how you've dealt with that, and also maybe how you've taught your students to deal with this kind of resistance.
Yes. Yes, good questions. So that project took off in a way that I never, ever, ever could have imagined. So I actually can't explain to you why something goes out into the world. Any culture maker will tell you, you can spend hours and hours on something and it just gets a fair to middling audience, and you can put together something that you think is like a little experiment and it becomes a big thing. Like, you just have so little control. It did seem like it arrived at a moment where there was also a lot of internal disability advocacy, and so it was an easy tool for people to pick up, to stand for lots of things. And now that is what it means to live with the convivial tool, which is to say, you actually don't get a control over how people interpret your work, too. If you let it go out in the public domain and it is free and appropriatable, then what that means is other people are using it in their rhetoric, and it's different maybe from yours. So I was eager to distance ourselves from wheelchair athleticism or sort of overcomer stories, but some people have interpreted that icon that I showed you as this kind of mandate that people with wheelchairs like become really physically fit and show people how heroic they are, and do a kind of overcomer performance. It's called inspiration porn in disability circles. I mean, it's a thing, and it's pernicious. I mean, we can laugh, but it is like an absurdist term, but it is a pernicious kind of logic. So, so people have said to me, that's inspiration porn. Like, you're sort of mandating this athletic wheelchair use. And I can only say, like, that it's a symbol. A symbol does a symbolic, metaphorical work and not a literalizing, work. So to me, that is foregrounding personhood and agency. And so I've written about that. I ended up needing to write some things of going like, here, this is what the spirit of this work is. And if you go to accessibleicon.org, you'll see that. I'm sort of saying this is what the project is supposed to be about. And I also do tell my students, guess what? If you're going to do this work, then you are as careful as you can be about the way that you plan it. You iterate and prototype in small ways. You build teams of coalitions. And also, you have to let it be what it is. I mean, any writer will tell you that, right? That you don't get to say how the work is being used. If anything, you're bringing about 50%, and what is being made of that work is the 50% that's coming back to you. So we've had an overwhelmingly positive response to that, and we also have had, for sure, that's the pushback, mostly within U.S. circles because of our attention right now, I think, to language and rhetoric. And I can only say that it is free and appropriatable. So thank you so much.